Well, we'll just dive in to our first session at 6:10 sharp, just as we planned. Good afternoon, everyone. Just like our chairman just said, almost a year ago, the first edition of this forum took place. It was an initiative for which we were terribly excited, but we thought that March 16th would be the greatest day to hold it in person, 4 days after everyone was on lockdown, so we had to cancel it in extremis, and we decided to postpone it a few months and holding it online a few months later in November. Now we find ourselves here, and this is the first in-person act that Fundación Rafael del Pino has organized. I'm delighted. I've always followed the Fundacion's talks, just like everyone who's here, and it's wonderful to be here in person instead of just seeing this through a screen. What we're seeing here today is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to going back to normal, but since this is just a start, we're not back to 100%. We still have some road to travel. So we decided to organize this forum in order to analyze normalcy. Is this a different normalcy? Is the previous normalcy we had? Are the rules we had before the pandemic still good? And the idea we had was to organize a couple of sessions in which we would be able to analyze the impact of the pandemic both in the short term as well as the structural trends we will see in the future. That's how we divided both roundtables. So this first session, we have 4 speakers, which I'll introduce very briefly. First and foremost, we have Ignacio La Torre. He's the chief economist at Arcano Partners, and he is the head of the advisory board of the Círculo de Empresarios. Ignacio got his degree from ICADE in economy and a degree in law from UNED. He's been working in investment and Deutsche Bank and Arcano for over 20 years. He's also the academic director of the economics school. He's also in charge of Arcano Research, which is a research arm that's becoming more and more successful. Our second speaker is Silvia Iranzo. Silvia Iranzo is an independent advisor for Indra. She got an economics degree from the Universidad Autónoma, and she's a doctor through INED, and she's got a degree from ES School. She's been, among other things, in charge of risk for the Spanish Central Bank. Emma Navarro is an independent advisor for Iberdrola Spain. She's got an international law degree from TREU and from Sorbonne and Madrid. She's also a state economist, and she's helped the International Fund in Washington. She's been the president of the ICO and the PI in charge of climate. And Emilio Lamo de Espinosa, whom you all know, he's a doctor in law. He's got a PhD in law from Santa Barbara. He's a member of the Royal Academy of Moral Science. Before being in charge of the Organización José Ortega Gasset, he became the president of the Fundación Arcano, a position he's held until the end of this year. He's a doctor honoris causa from several colleges. He's published several articles and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. And the debate, as we said, is going to take 1 hour, 56 minutes now. With Ignacio, we'll talk about the impact of the crisis, our current situation, the perspectives, long-term perspective. Silvia will analyze the consequences of international cooperation, value chains, how businesses can help with recovery. With Emma, we'll take a look at the responses governments have given and how they've stepped up to the challenges. And with Emilio, we'll see the impact this has had on geopolitics, the power balance, the impact on social models, and economic supremacy. As I said, we have 1 hour, and I would like for all of you to just offer 7-8 minute interventions. I will actually cut you off if you go over. And after that, we will have a short debate among yourselves and everyone who's here. So starting with Ignacio, I wanted you to talk about the situation the pandemic has given us for the economy and society, because now we have to run some diagnostics on our situation, where our recovery is, what's our starting point in order to boost recovery, not only here. I forgot to tell you, we are not going to only talk about Spain, we're going to talk about the whole world, Europe and the whole world, not only Spain. And we want to know what's happening in different regions as a consequence of the advancements in vaccination processes, which risks and challenges are before us. And for you to explain to us, there are people now who are saying that we find ourselves in a stagflation situation. We are living in the shortage economy, given the lack of offerings we have in our productive systems, and the implications this will have. So you've got 7 minutes, Ignacio. Well, thank you very much. In order to be coherent when analyzing economy, I want to talk a couple of minutes about the evolution of the pandemic, and using that as a starting point, talk about the economic situation. I think that when it comes to the pandemic, we're finding ourselves drowned by a myriad of information from media telling us that jabs stop working after 4 months, and we're talking about the efficacy when it comes to contagion and an efficacy against hospitalization and death. It is true that after 4 months, they don't do anything for contagion, but they do help to reduce death rates. 6 months after they took vaccinations in Israel, we can see that deaths have kept steady. So what really leads the economy is the risk of hospitalization and death that lead to lockdown, not actual infection, and that's going down. And if we take a look at previous waves, for every 100 people who got sick, 10 would go to the hospital and 2 would pass. And now for every 100 infected, 0.3 are passing. So I think that the pandemic is becoming less and less relevant for the economy. Will we reach herd immunity? I don't think so. We would have been able to reach it with a previous strain, but not with Delta. It will remain endemic, just like AIDS or flu. And as time goes on, it will be less and less relevant, and we'll get a little boost each year, and we'll live with it just as we live with the flu. But I don't think that it's going to become less and less relevant for the economy. And if we take a look at the economic graph, so to speak, the world is going to grow about 6%, 5% next year. So this is going to be the strongest economic growth ever since the Second World War. That's the good news. The bad news is that such a strong growth means there will be an inflationary risk, which is what worries most people now, with reason. So I'm going to dip my toe in the pool. Last year, I drafted a report, and we talked about a risk of inflation due to monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus that we had only seen after World War II. What we saw after World War II was high inflation. We're already seeing this inflation. Our opinion on inflation level for very long. We think there will be several aspects which mean that inflation will go down next year. And in the States, they will be in 2.5, and Europe will have 1.7% inflation. We think that these levels are reasonable for our new monetary policies. Then, as far as banks are concerned, we think they will take a look at rates, and we think that we will have negative rates for a couple of years, both at the medium and short term, and this will have an impact, which I'll mention later, which, as far as the question you asked earlier, a hot labor market, there's not a risk of high inflation above 3 or 4%. The main cost for companies is labor costs. That's about 3/4. And the greatest indicator is Atlanta Wage Tracker in the U.S., which is 3.8% right now. So we take a look at this growth. If they go up by 3.8%, wages go up by 3.8%, costs will go up by 3.8%, and we've seen that they've gone up by 2%. So if we raise wages 3.8% and productivity 2%, so what we'll do to keep margins will be to raise prices by 1.6. So even if wages go up, 1.5 I think is reasonable in the future. And if that isn't the situation, we go even higher, well, the Fed will have to take part. And the last question, or second to last question you asked, this shortage economy, we had the crisis in spring, and we were comparing this contraction with the Great Depression. And it is true that when it happens, we would take offering out of the market, and most offering curves are rigid, so you can't take out vessels and then bring them back. What happened? This crisis is an exogenous crisis. It came from a pathogen. It's not an endogenic crisis. So as soon as the pathogen left, people reacted by consuming faster than many economists expected. So we have restricted offering, so restricted demand, and we have this impact on our supply chain. And when we're in lockdown, we tend to consume more goods but less services. So we've had a huge impact on goods. Just so you get an idea, U.S. citizens, service went 93 out of 100, which that had an impact on everyone's supply chain. And now we're in 110 and services are -5. So if we take a look at this trend, we will demand less goods and more services as time goes on. And throughout next year, this will be solved. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I think that by 2022, we will be in a much more normal situation as far as scarcity is concerned. Worries, I'll mention 3. If we're going to have real negative rates, which I think that this will help governments get rid of leverage on public debt, well, savings can suffer. Saving in bonds and sovereign bonds or accounts, well, a relevant part in sovereign bonds will have to go to different assets, and I think that it will move into the real estate market, which is what we are seeing, an increase in housing at a huge rate, especially in the US, the UK, or Germany. This can have an impact in the medium term on financial stability. And then, as a general rule, private debt is much more important than public debt, but I think that private debt is much, much more relevant. When we reach 1.9, 1.8, the GDP, the country that's in the worst situation is China. They're at 1.2. I think that as far as their real estate market is, well, they're in their worst situation. They were building 11 houses per 1,000 inhabitants, and it's usually 3. So this is going to have a lot of implications for the world because China is half of the world's raw resources demand. So I think that they might suffer a recession. This will have an impact on Latin America and Asian countries. And our last consideration is that at the end of the day, our monetary policy wants to get demand back, that we have the exact same employment levels as before the crisis, but there's a second impact, which is we reduce unemployment, we reduce a wage disparity, but we reduce wealth because those who have assets, well, the prices go up. So in the medium to short term, we're going to have a lower disparity of wages, but a higher wealth disparity. Thank you very much, Ignacio. I think that you raised a couple concerns and questions which you can ask later. I think that we've got a way of asking these questions online. I don't know if I was the one who had to explain this. If not, someone else can explain this. Silvia, the crisis, as we all know, brought the complete collapse of international business, of many services as well. It also brought protectionist reactions in many countries in order to protect themselves, of course, and it fragmented many value chains. This has recovered very, very fast. The OMC has increased their expectations. Oh, excuse me. That's the timer. It's much closer than what we expected. The World Trade Organization is increasing their predictions, but is this more of a rebound? Can we keep this increase for a long period? We also have this scarcity we are seeing in raw goods as well as chips, which we think will have an impact on international business, and this with a multilateral trade system which doesn't work, which has to be renewed, and which, well, it is true that President Trump left many multilateral organizations, President Biden is back more or less, but they don't seem really keen on reforming the World Trade Organization. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, Silvia, if you think that trade is going to be the business for this recovery as it was for the previous one.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. Well, first matter, how has international trade reacted after the pandemic? Well, as you have so well said, the first thing that was done during lockdown was a total interruption of international trade because the port workers were in lockdown. There were no workers to work on the vessels. And although there's been a certain recovery, we're still seeing the sequelae of social distancing, which is impossible in vessels, and then also the need for quarantines. The fact is that everything related to the pandemic has affected international trade very, very much, just the way it has affected tourism even more than other industries. And the most important indicator is that world trade has dropped 5.3% in 2020, which is more than the drop of the world GDP, which dropped 3.1%. So in that regard, it's a very vulnerable industry in the face of a phenomenon such as a pandemic. In 2021, there's been a rebound. Indeed, there's been a rebound, and the WTO is talking about growth figures for this year, 2021, of 10.8%, whereas before it was just talking about 10%. So it's adjusted upwards its outlook for the full year. And for the coming year, we're talking about 4.7% in growth. Indeed, there's a rebound effect. It's what they call the baseline effect, because when the variable is much lower during a period, when you then do the catching up, you have to grow far more. It's like a popular marathon where everybody's running, someone gets injured, they have to stop, and if they need to recover their position among the rest of the group, they're going to have to run much, much faster. And this is a little bit what has happened with trade. Does this mean that growth of world trade, and I'm basically talking about goods. Services are a different story. But as far as goods are concerned, there's no doubt that what we're seeing at the moment, and this is the consensus of all analysts, is that in the future, we're just going to recover the previous trend from 2019 and previous years. And that trend will go towards greater deglobalization. In other words, trade is not growing at the same rate as GDP since that major crisis of 2008. And in this regard, going back to your last question, world trade does not appear to be the driver for growth of the world economy. And just not to have to go too far, in Spain, for example, there's an exception. In Spain, yes, in 2020 and 2021, trade is definitely being a driver for growth. It is a very positive contribution to the growth of GDP, and our trade deficit is going down. But of course, we're talking about the world economy at an international level. It does not appear that world trade is going to be the driver of the recovery, yet it's subject to a lot of uncertainty. The word uncertainty is constantly being repeated in all of these economic reports. And first of all, when are we going to unblock the major ports in China, in the delta of the Pearl River? There's still a congestion there. In the United States, in Los Angeles, a Long Beach port, there is still a huge jam there. And as Ignacio has mentioned, this is due to this spectacular increase of demand in a very short period of time, and supply has not been able to catch up. However, gradually we're adjusting to this. There is also huge uncertainties due to the pandemic. There is a total lack of knowledge, significant lack of knowledge about new emerging variants and how we're going to respond. Are there going to be new lockdowns? And there are other series of uncertainties, for example, bottlenecks of production. These bottlenecks, and we've all read news about the lack of microchips that is affecting many different industries, especially the automotive industry. It's also affecting foreign trade. In Spain, the export of vehicles has dropped by 10% because of these bottlenecks. So world trade could grow more if we unblock the ports, if we pay attention to these bottlenecks due to, for example, the lack of microchips. And then there's another element, which is the rise in prices, the price of energies above all, which is something that is cross-functional to the whole world economy. If prices go up very much, then companies cannot be profitable. And going back to the recent news of Spanish companies that have had to close down their production, Fertiberia, for example, and these companies are not going to be able to address exports, and very often production is falling. So we need to untangle all these massive because of supply, and we'll see what happens. As far as the value chains, I think, are going to continue with the previous trend prior to the pandemic. And that process of fragmentation, of offshoring that we had seen since the previous financial crisis, that has slowed down. We are deglobalizing, and what we're actually seeing is a nearshoring and even inshoring. And the pandemic has only heightened this because we see that COVID goods such as medical goods and medical supplies in general, we realize we cannot become dependent on a country as China that was selling most of those supplies. So we're kind of relocating our production and not the opposite. And in any case, there is definitely being a redistribution of the existing offshoring from China to other areas, for example, Vietnam or Malaysia, because costs in China are increasing significantly. There is far more legal insecurity. We've seen certain shocks from the Chinese government, especially to the technological industry. And this has frightened some companies. Do I have much time? Just 1 minute. Okay, I will summarize very, very quickly. International cooperation, multilateral relationships, as you have said so well, Alfredo. Biden has wanted to embrace multilateralism once again, but not so much at WTO. He had the chance to name or appoint judges for the appeal, the body of appeal.
No lo ve claro todavía.
And he's not very clear about this yet. The European Union is didn't have enough countries yet, and maybe it's not so legitimate just yet. Have they done something in that regard? Yes, we've seen the agreement for investments between the European Union and China, which had been paralyzed until now for political reasons. We've also seen growth in the Asian countries and all the major exporters in that area, China, Japan, etc. This is going to take some time to take root as far as all the objectives, but we've also seen the Airbus-Boeing agreement of the United States and the European Union, where we've taken the self-imposed tariffs. And finally, with this I finish, we recently read about the request by China to increase China to join the CPTPP. So this no longer includes the United States, and yet, since Trump withdrew from that, perhaps China will join this organization. Well, I don't really see this because the two requirements, one is to reduce subsidies to companies, and the other is that to make sure data flows, and it's very difficult for China to do this. But it's interesting to see how these trade elements of the major world trade either involve China directly or actually, China will become the elephant in the room. And that's the end of my participation.
Thank you very much. I'll give Emma the word. No governments were actually ready for the pandemic. All governments were caught off guard, and they immediately had to start applying protection they had to start implementing protection systems for all of their companies and citizens, and they had to basically start improvising. They started getting into uncharted waters to see how they would weather the storm, and at the end of the day, what we found was we found ourselves to implement expansive fiscal policies as well as monetary policies that would allow us to increase public expenditure to combat the economic crisis the pandemic brought with it. And the response is that right now we have a multi-million plan in Europe, which are the recovery funds. We've got a Biden plan, which is a multi-billion plan that will have to be passed by Congress, although it's facing some problems. We have a lot of companies on assisted living, and we have to deal with this one way or another. And at the end of the day, the thing is that of these large fiscal expansion policies, what we need is they have to really change our productive model because they're generating a lot of public debt. And I want to ask Emma to tell us a little bit about the first reaction these governments have had and the policies we're enacting all over the world, these expansive policies we are seeing.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Talking about the economic policy response, whether it's been appropriate or not, I think there's significant consensus that the response has been appropriate. We were facing an unprecedented crisis, and we needed a very rigorous response. And there are certain studies and calculations that prove that the International Monetary Fund, for example, said that without all these measures of economic policy that have been put into place, the effect would have been far worse from the damages we've already seen. The drop in activities could have been even 3 times greater. That said, as far as tax policies and taking into account that practically all countries have implemented the same kind of measures, there have definitely been a difference in the speed of response, which has depended obviously also on the ability of the various countries. And we've seen that, for example, in the United States, they've applied very powerful stimuli packages, far more than in Europe. And in fact, the stimuli that have been implemented until now, without counting the current plans that are being addressed, it's around 28% of the GDP of the American economy. And in the United States, which has already recovered the income levels prior to the pandemic, and furthermore, although they haven't recovered the employment levels, but they do have a labor market with 10 million vacancies. So they have considered the discussion at the last minute with this last plan of the stimulus might be excessive. However, in the remaining countries, the consensus has been that the response was extremely necessary to mitigate this crisis, to protect production, and that's what had to be done. As you have said so well, Alfredo, the big challenge we're facing for fiscal policy is the increase that we've seen that has been very significant in the debt levels of the various countries. Not just the debt levels, but we've also seen that in this period, some economies have increased their levels of structural deficit as well. And this is the case of Europe in many economies, also in the United States. But in the case of Europe, where the fiscal policy inevitably still has a role to play in the short term, in the coming year, to recover our activity. We haven't quite recovered our GDP levels prior to the pandemic. So here, regardless of the fact that fiscal policy is going to need to continue being expansive, it's also necessary, and this is what all organizations are indicating, that it should become more surgical with just temporary measures, not to continue increasing the structural deficit. And also temporary measures because we need to avoid turning the economy into a zombie. This is also a very important element. And in any case, in Europe, the rules of the Stability Treaty were suspended so that countries could implement measures to respond to the crisis. But now we're expecting that these rules will be implemented once again in 2023. And this is going to no doubt be a very significant conditioning for governments and fiscal policy. I'm not going to get into the discussion of the reform of the rules of the Stability Pact, which is something that started a few years ago, and now it seems to be reviving, and now it seems to be very present. But what's very, very clear, and I think everyone's very aware of, is that once the recovery is well consolidated, it's going to be necessary to reduce the levels of public debt and structural deficit levels that have accumulated. And it's absolutely true that low interest rates that we currently have are a certain relief, and actual negative interest rates, as Ignacio has mentioned, will help. But I don't think we can fool ourselves by thinking that such high public debt levels are obviously make us very vulnerable, because we can't depend on interest levels being low forever, or thinking that they're never going to go up. And also that same level of public debt means that the possibility of refinancing obligations are very significant. And furthermore, we lose ability to respond in economic policy, what is known as room for fiscal maneuver, because our economies are so highly indebted. Another very important element in Europe has been our joint response that has been adopted. First of all, with a series of programs by certain organizations, the European Commission, and loan programs, and by the European Investment Bank, etc., but also through the next generation recovery funds. I don't want to talk too much about these recovery funds because we've already talked a lot about them, but I do think they have certain elements in this particular situation, and given the challenges we face, are very important. On the one hand, these are instruments for cohesion because they're of a significant size, 770 billion, mostly through subsidies, and targeting the economies that have been most impacted by the crisis. And this is very significant in this current context, because one of the risks that we're facing in Europe at the moment is that the pandemic may increase economic inequality, not just the level of indebtedness, which is one of the variables, but also as far as inequalities in income levels of the various countries. And although it's not an instrument for macroeconomic stabilization, which it's still necessary in the Eurozone, these funds are going to provide fiscal capability to the various economies. And the other positive effect of these funds is the combination they have, which is so valuable at this moment, of, on the one hand, focusing on investments such as the green transition or digitalization, where we know they're going to be very necessary, will require a lot of investment in the coming years. And on the other hand, the combination with structural forms that are going to allow increasing potential growth, your ability to grow, which is one of the abilities available to Europe. And if we generate growth, you also help somehow to correct the fiscal imbalance that has been generated. And to finish talking about monetary policy, I don't really want to go into that because I think Ignacio's already discussed this, but just two considerations. Obviously, monetary policy has also been very important, not only because it's allowed credit to continue flowing and it's avoided financial crises, but it's been key for the success of fiscal policy to fund expenditure programs, and it's absorbed a major part of public debt, a significant part of public debt that has been issued by governments. And now what we're seeing is that the withdrawal of the stimuli, for example, in the United States, it seems to be happening very soon, according to the Fed's indications. So that might pose certain challenges for fiscal policy, because even if it's done very gradually and even if it occurs very slowly, obviously until now, governments had enjoyed significant support from this monetary policy. And finally, also related to what Silvia has mentioned, there are a series of phenomena that we are observing. For example, they're also a challenge for economic policy and fiscal policy. For example, we are seeing stocks on offer and the effect on raw materials and what effect that's going to have on the world economy and what fiscal policy can do about that. And other more structural phenomena such as what has already been mentioned of deglobalization, and that also requires significant room for maneuver.
Thank you very much, Emma. We'll finish up with Emilio. One of the outcomes of the pandemic has been that states have increased their intervention on economies a lot, and that's something that we will have to revert at some point, and something that we found with the situation in the United States, with which, like Trump left all multilateral organizations back in their time. Biden has inched back to some of them, not others. And on the other hand, the U.S. has defined the Indo-Pacific area as crucial for their international policy, ignoring Europe, which has been hurt by COVID and internal breaks, such as what we're seeing in Poland, and this geopolitical strife in which China is becoming more and more relevant. And it is true that their state capitalism model is starting to sink. So we wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what we've been seeing, the situation that has been accelerated by the pandemic. Well, I've been hearing that China's been sinking for many years, for many decades, just like the US is in decay, and it's not true. It hasn't really happened. What I wanted to say is that even though the pandemic has caught us all off guard, we had been forewarned. I do want to say this, that the WHO, think tanks, all systems had incorporated pandemics as a strategic risk, along with climate change and migration and many other things. For example, our national security system here in Spain identified a pandemic as something important, and Spain was something that really relied on the service sector, the service field, and tourism. We were at risk, and we didn't heed their warning. And well, this has been basically, the pandemic has been a stress test for everything, for all situations, for all internal governance, for governments, for multilateral organizations. It's been a stress test in which most, if not all, organizations have fared poorly, if not badly. One of them, some of the ones that have done better, I think that Spanish society has advanced, has done very well, and technical science, within 11 months, we already had a vaccination, which, by the way, under 40% of all of the world's population has been vaccinated, so we still have a long way to go. In Latin America, for example, well, that's a very important situation for Spain. Well, it's still a dramatic situation. So that's the first comment I wanted to make. Secondly, it's evident that given this, multilateral institutions did not have the capacity nor the strength to react. The UN didn't do, the WHO didn't, the G20 didn't do anything. The World Health Organization actually fared very poorly. It is true that the European Union doesn't have clear competency, the clear skills, but we could have done something. The Schengen area exploded. They started organizing protection policies over PPEs, and well, it was just shameful. And most societies have looked for protection in all institutions where we are always protected. When I find myself in trouble, when people are in trouble, we go back home. And when communities have problems, they go to the state. These are the two organizations that offer protection. And in these last couple of months, we've been receiving instruction from our states, and we have found ourselves just at home. We've all found ourselves relinquished to our homes, which has been eased by digitalization, but we've really restated. Like, states have had to undertake their responsibilities because there were no other institutions that could really do this. What has this entailed? This has reinforced states at a political level, exceptional measures, literally exceptional situations. I remember that the British Parliament during the Second World War was open all throughout the war in spite of bombings, of Parliament bombings. Well, we closed it for a long period, and we will see if it's constitutional or not. Measures that really go over constitutional frameworks, political and economical policies. This has also renationalized economies. We've had an extraordinary national debt, and this will probably keep on going. Freedom House actually published a very interesting report on how the pandemic had created a democratic lockdown, and we can see that a lot of democracies got eroded. And monitors of democracy, they talked about the autocratization of our digital world. So we've seen how all states have been reinforced. This is another element, and what we're seeing right now is we are reorienting. There are no substantial changes here, but basically this is all accelerating. There's a geopolitical change of something we've been seeing for a couple decades. There's a great relationship between the U.S. and China, but at the end of the day, is a change in both societies. China has problems, and given the problems it has, it projects a great deal of its bad situation. Taiwan is a situation. Let's not talk about the United States. When Trump became president, we wondered, and all think tanks, Federico can remember this, Trump is just a small crib, and is Trump just a hitch on the road in the U.S.? Well, no, it wasn't a hitch. We have to acknowledge this. This wasn't just a hitch. It's a structural issue. Joe Biden has several problems, and the way of dealing with this, of getting all of this population back, is to project these problems onto protectionism, onto America first has become America only, and this is becoming more and more clear. All geopolitical tendencies have been reoriented. China has weathered the pandemic more or less well, but this pivot to Asia, this U.S. pivot to Asia that Obama started, well, it just blew up due to the pandemic. Australia's relationship with China was also affected, and the truth of the matter is that right now, what we were seeing in an underlying way, well, now it's just open. The geopolitical vector right now, key tensions, the rising power and the waxing power, which is the Thucydides trap. When we have a waxing power, we can see that a rising power can overtake it, and they can war and take over. And this is a huge temptation, and there's empirical evidence that show that Thucydides traps have led to this situation, that have led to war. So the U.S. is reorienting itself. It's clearly abandoning Afghanistan without really asking its allies, and they're focusing on the Indo-Pacific area, with the tension between Malacca and Taiwan, which is the key theater for tension. And all U.S. think tanks are openly talking if they can win a war against China, which is really worrisome that Foreign Affairs is publishing articles on this. They're talking about a new Cold War. I don't think so, but I think it's an extremely toasty piece, but identifying the other as an enemy can actually make them the enemy. So the Thucydides trap can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that Biden's policy with China is very aggressive, and I think the AUKUS is a slap on the face. They've warned China. Let's take a look at China with nuclear submarines with the help of Australia, but this is a slap on the face of Europe, on the back of France. And what we are seeing now is, well, basically Europe is left by the wayside, and this is what Churchill called the Anglosphere, the 3 plus 4 plus 5, the 3 and the AUKUS, the US, the UK, which finally is finding, well, they're finally finding a great position for them. The 3 of the AUKUS, the 4 in the Quad, US, Australia, Japan, and India, and the five guys. It's the alliance between the 5 countries in the Anglosphere, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. They share spionage, resources, technology, and that's basically what we are seeing now. And Europe is, well, left outside. And the thing is, how can the European Union react? It's a shame that Natalie Tocci is not here. Natalie Tocci was the one who developed for Federica Mogherini the European Global Strategy, in which they proposed as a relevant way for Europe to get back its strategic relevance. So this is the most important motto right now, how Europe can become strategically relevant again. It doesn't seem that easy. It doesn't seem easy for Europe to have an external policy, and it seems less and less unlikely that they have a common safety. And it's not about spending more, as people usually say. Europe spends 3 times more than Russia. We've got 1.5 million troops, so we've got more than enough expenses, and then Russia has 1/3 of the expenses we have. It's not about spending more. It's about spending better and being willing to use this, because you can have an army as big as you want, but if you're not willing to send it to war, you can't really use it. You have to send it to fight fires, not actually fight, because if they don't fight, we don't know what problem we'll have. So that's the underlying issue. So it's not easy, much less without Angela Merkel, for Europe to learn, like Josep Borrell has said, to use the language of power, to start talking the language of power. I could go on. If you give me 1 minute. Yeah, okay, 1 minute. Just to wrap up, I think that our key issue right now, when it comes to the next 3-4, we have to give China enough space. It's 300 million. They're there. They're very active. They've got technology. They've got strength. We have to give them a seat at the table. We have to make them feel comfortable enough in the international sphere. U.S. policy right now does not seem to be going that way, and that worries me. That's the last thing I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emilio. Well, we've got 12 more minutes. Thank you very much, everyone, for being mindful of time. You can also ask questions here with a microphone. Are they all on our phone? Okay, well, I don't know if I have any. Let me check. Nope. So I'll start. Well, the thing with new technologies right here is not going to work. But anyway, if you have any questions, well, I'll be more than happy for you to give them to us. I want to link with this last subject Emilio mentioned, this rivalry between China and the U.S., remembering a comment I've heard earlier when it comes to Chinese and U.S. growth, which is always interesting for me to hear. everyone thinks that China in a couple of years is going to be the leading economy in the world. And there are people like Ignacio who say that, no, can you please explain this? Yeah, well, just like we have advertising ads from CNV, from the CNMV, economic profitability is not as good. The USSR grew 3 times as fast as the US, but then they started growing much more slowly. At the end of the day, this depends on demographics, how much they grow in hours worked and how productive those hours are. So at the end of the day, it's actual productivity that matters. So China has been losing active population, and it seems like they are going to have a negative hour growth, and overall productivity has been a negative in the last couple of years. So when they send a worker from a rural environment to an urban environment, well, that's good, but there's a limit to that. So I think that if we introduce these elements and we take a look at this, what I see is that at the end of the day, China will never reach the U.S. There might be a productivity miracle, but I don't think that this is not the base scenario. And if we take into account that China has a lot of private debt, so they're not really growing like they should, that's going to be lower structural growth. So that begs the question if China will overcome the U.S. It's curious that when I thought you wanted to, I don't know if I don't agree. Please disagree amongst yourselves. I think that the problem is a population, a demographic problem. It's the volume, and that's brutal. 1.3 billion people with a productivity of 20 or 25% of the U.S. citizen. It's more than 315 million people, so that's our situation. It is well known that right now China's economy, they published this in 2014, that was the year that China's economy would overcome the U.S. economy when it came to economic power in parity. And I think that given large figures, if China increases its productivity from 20 to 30%, they've already won. It is true that they have problems, but it is true that the U.S. also has problems. So I think that this is basically, well, the technology they have. They're a working society. The thing people said that they're sleeping. No, they're never asleep. They've always been active all throughout their history. They're very well organized. They have an elite that's very, very well trained. Let's not fool ourselves. This is a dictatorship, but they have learned at Stanford, Columbia, the people who run China. I think I would bet that in 10 to 15 years they will overcome the U.S., but I might be wrong, and I always allow myself to change my mind. So, they're telling me we do have microphones, so if anyone here has a question, please. Yes? You wanted to say something? Yes, there you go. Up here, please. We've got 7 minutes left. I wanted to ask, in response to what Emilio just said, a lot of leadership in Europe, the lack of leadership we have in Europe right now since Angela Merkel left, can this mean that there be another people, and it's obviously not Macron, who could take the reins, bearing in mind our current situation? And I've recently been to Europe, and I think that in Italy, Draghi has extended itself very significantly, so that even people who find themselves skeptical when it came to their country and Draghi, they are happy with it. Is Draghi the substitute, someone who can focus this lack of leadership in Europe? I don't see anyone who can really fill in the shoes of Angela Merkel, because it takes a long time. As you said, Macron will not be good. I agree with that. Draghi is in Italy, and they will stay in Italy, so they can't really undertake that leadership position. Let's hope. I wish he could, and this leadership were to blossom, because I think that the European Union finds itself at sea without a rudder, and the European Union built itself not only under the umbrella of the United States, but bolstered by the U.S., and we've lost this. Right now, NATO, is brain dead, but like Macron said, but Trump said that NATO was dead, so this is not a great situation. So the European Union, without this umbrella and in a clear situation with lack of safety and security, without solid states, I think that internal strife can break us down. Poland, like we mentioned, as we've seen in the press, this showcases that Brexit has had an impact, and we might see more Brexit in coming years. I think that, I am moderately pessimistic. I'm obviously pro-European, but I'm moderately pessimistic when it comes to the future of the Union in these coming decades. Any other questions in the room? Oh, yes. Santiago has a question right there. Yes. I wanted to ask Emilio, what's the basis for you saying that the European Union was bolstered by the U.S.? I think that it was created in spite of the U.S. That's my question. I had a comment, but the question is basically that. The U.S. bolstered from the get-go the creation of a strong Europe based on two reasons. First and foremost, because it saw the negative consequences of the policies that came after the First World War, and they launched the Marshall Plan and a serious European reconstruction plan, which has had a good effect, and which has had and giving the appearance of the USSR as its rival, the European Union was a bulwark to the, let's say, Sovietizing of the European Union. Let's not forget that Europe and France and Germany had very relevant communist parties, especially in France and Italy. So the U.S. definitely encouraged the creation of the European Union, and without the protection of NATO, there would not have been a European Union. Without NATO, the tanks of the Warsaw Pact would have left Moscow and would have taken a stroll all over Europe without any problems. So it is clear that the European Union has been another political projection of the U.S. I think that this is in every book I've seen. This doesn't mean that it wasn't helped along by other Europeans. But let's see what risk we run right now without this protection, without this umbrella. Thank you very much, Emilia.